Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar reflecting on COP26, a cross-sector discussion. I'm Sarah Ridgen, I'm the Policy and Communications Officer at the Society for the Environment, and this event is the first in a series of webinars looking at how we can deliver on the ambitions and commitments agreed at COP26. So it's a series organised by the Cross-Sectorial Environmental Policy Forum, which enables us to explore questions and topics from the perspective of a variety of different disciplines. So without further ado, I'm now going to introduce the chair for today's panel, Dr. Colin Church, CM, CEO at the Institute of Materials, Minerals and Mining. So over to you, Colin, and I'm sure this will be an informative and engaging discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. And for those of you who were expecting to see Will Pope in the chair instead of me, he does send his apologies. He went to Glasgow and got COVID, so he hasn't been able to join us this morning. So we're joined by a very interesting panel this morning, some of whom were literally in Glasgow up until the weekend and still suffering from it. Others who have been following it very closely from their own perspectives. And I think our aim is to really give some first reflection, some hot takes, if you like, and what that might immediately mean for the different sectors, organisations around the table. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give each of the panelists a few moments to introduce themselves and say a few top level reflections, and we'll then ask a few questions that we've pre-cooked, as it were. But please do put your questions to the panel in the Q&A box, and we will answer audience questions as soon as we can. So the Q&A box at the bottom, stick them in there and we'll get to them. If they're directed at a particular person, if you could highlight that, otherwise we'll either pick somebody or do Buggin's turn. So we're going to do the order is a bit random. It's just basically the order that everybody joined our panel earlier, and that means that Joseph Lewis is going to get the chance to go first, and Joseph is the policy lead at the Institution of Environmental Sciences. So Joseph, over to you.
Thank you, Colin. Like Colin says, I'm policy lead at the Institution of Environmental Sciences and now also co-author of our Manifesto for Transformative Change, our major piece of writing that came out of COP, so you can have a read of that. But on the subject itself, COP26, well, we knew it had the potential to be a historic event. I think it was billed as many as being potentially the final stand in the battle against climate change, with the potential to either be a massive success that would put us on a pathway towards reaching 1.5, towards fighting back against climate change, or something where we would see a historic failure. And from my perspective, I don't think we're in either of those positions now. I think where we are is that a lot of the historic decisions have been kicked down the road to a later place, maybe Egypt and COP27. And elaborating on that a little bit, for environmental science, the story of COP really is a story about systems and pathways and the work we're doing to try and change those systems through those pathways towards better things than they are now. A few really big things that came out of COP26. Number one on my list is the deforestation pledge that we saw from a lot of countries, with a massive potential to make a difference if it's realized. But that realization depends on the pledge being kept to over the next years until 2030 and seeing it through to action starting right now. Secondly, the big pledge around finance from GFANZ, this Glasgow Financial Alliance of Net Zero, where potentially $130 trillion of private investment could be in play, but it depends on getting that money into the right places, getting it out of assets it's locked into now into sustainable ones, and ensuring that what that money represents on the ground over the next 10 years or so is actually going to align with the science for how we decarbonize. Thirdly, we saw this big methane pledge, again, massive potential to, in the short term in particular, make a really big difference to the slowing of global warming, giving us a little bit more time, but again, it depends on actually implementing that pledge across contexts and being more ambitious in future iterations, because the pledge of 30% we've got to now probably won't be enough to get us to that 1.5. And then we've also seen massive commitments from individual states through the nationally determined contributions, these NDCs, that they've put in and updated over the past month or so. And it could be really significant. But at the same time, there's still a lot more to be done there. You'll have heard in headlines that if you only look at the 2030 targets, we're sitting at 2.4 at the moment, nowhere near good enough. If you throw in some additional pledges, maybe we're moving towards 2.1. And if you really get the most optimistic possible scenario out of what we've heard committed from people, we're still only at 1.8. And so even to get to that 2.4, what we need to do to ensure those commitments are met is we need to ensure delivery. We need to inject a bit more science into them so that those delivery pathways are more robust, moving us down towards that 2.1 angle. And we need to ensure that they stand up to unexpected changing circumstances. So with all these issues, we see big commitments which potentially make a big difference, but the battle now is to ensure those commitments are met and implemented in a way that aligns with science-based pathways. And that's where we're going to see environmental science and our sector falling in over the next few years, particularly this crucial next year between now and Egypt, where we might see another ratcheting up of ambition from countries. And environmental science needs to be much better integrated into those conversations to ensure that we're making the best out of implementation, we're getting those pledges on science-accurate pathways, and we're succeeding. So a lot is still up in the air from my perspective, Colin, and I think environmental science has a massive role to play to fill that gap. But what I will say is this: we've seen a major narrative shift over the past 6 months. Climate has been taken much more seriously now by global leaders as something which needs to happen. And the question is about how it happens. And we need to inject more science into that. But in a world of uncertainty where delivery is king, the way that people with power think about the issues is paramount. And the fact that people are taking this more seriously, are willing to bring science to the table, is something that we can be happy about COP26.
Thank you very much indeed, Joseph. Our next panelist is Jason Reeves, Chartered Environmentalist and a member and head of policy at the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. Jason, over to you, please, for your thoughts.
Thanks very much, Colin, and thanks for having me today. So I think I'm going to reiterate a lot of the things that Joseph's just said, actually. So, I mean, I was going to talk about we've made progress, yes, but is it enough? No. I was going to talk about the where we're getting to on warming and degrees of warming, and I was going to mention the same numbers that Joseph did, and they aren't good enough, let's be honest. One more to add to that, I think, on the climate action tracker, suggesting that where we stand at the moment, that where we are in terms of government policy and actual action, we're probably aiming for 2.7 degrees of warming by the end of the century, which clearly isn't good enough. So we need to be aiming to implement all of those things to get us closer to that 1.5. That's still a really big ask, so lots more work to do on that. If we assume that we are aiming at around 2 degrees of warming, that's an awful lot of loss that we're willing to accept as well. So from my perspective, and I think when we listen to a lot of certainly the opening leaders' speeches and some of the closing speeches, that just isn't going to be good enough for a lot of countries, particularly those low-lying countries in the Pacific, Caribbean, the Maldives, Bangladesh. From a nature perspective, 2 degrees of warming also means that we're willing to accept the loss of things like coral reefs. So there's a lot to unpack there, both morally and scientifically. If we move on to nature more specifically, nature had its own day at COP26, which from my understanding is the first time it's had its own entire day, which is great. From that perspective, and it links into what Joseph said earlier about things being taken more seriously. Nature's definitely being taken more seriously, and it's moved into that climate agenda, which is brilliant. It was muddled a little bit with agriculture and land use being in that day as well, which they could have had their own days easily, but the fact that it was there is brilliant. I'll mention the Leaders' Pledge on Deforestation that Joseph mentioned as well. Brilliant to have that, and there's some interesting wording in there around redesigning agriculture, which I think is crucial to that deforestation declaration, and the fact there's 141 signatories to that now is brilliant as well. So we've got 3/4 of the world's countries signed up to that. They just need to implement it now, so that's a much bigger question, so we need to move on to that. It's great to have that focus on forestry as well, and trees. But it does seem to be this major emphasis that trees are going to solve all our problems, and that's not necessarily true. We need to make sure that's an all-encompassing, holistic view on nature. That needs to include peatlands, grasslands, the oceans in particular as well. We've had a whole lot of declarations. I'm sure we can get into those as well. Methane, coal, move to electric vehicles, making green technology more affordable and available. Funding of overseas fossil fuels, phasing that out as well was great. So a few of those things. On the nature as well, sort of official. So there's a Get Nature Positive pledge. It was made by over 90 companies during COP as well. That's great. So private companies starting to look at their supply chains, their processes, logistics, moving that to a nature positive. So not just no net loss, we're looking at nature positive now. So that's great to see that kind of discussion happening. And then the UK government introduced what the FACT dialogue, forest, agriculture, commodities and trade. And that's another one where it's great to see those things being incorporated together, and we're not just looking at nature on its own over there and agriculture over there and trade over there, actually bringing these things together. So that's great. In the actual Glasgow Climate Pact as well, it's really brilliant to see the fact that they're explicitly acknowledging the link between nature and climate, and the fact that we have to address them together. And then also in the mitigation section of the pact, specifically addressing nature and ecosystem restoration and protection, equally along with emissions reduction and technological fixes. So it's great to have that sitting there in that space as well. Like Joseph said as well, these things aren't legally binding, so we need to see action from government and implement them at policy level. And then I'll leave a few things for the discussion later on, but just a couple of things I thought perhaps were missing from COP26. One for me was around the marine environment and fisheries and blue carbon. I didn't see much conversation around that. And then the other one was around resource consumption and things like circular economy and the economics of things, but Adam might have a few more things to say on that. I thought I didn't see much of that at COP, so I'll leave it there, and we can come back to some of the sort of challenges and specific actions for the sector in the questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jason. I think you've set Adam up rather nicely for his conversation. And Adam, you're up next, and Dr. Adam Reid, also a chartered environmentalist and currently the president of the Chartered Institution of Wastes Management. Adam.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Jason, for the warm up. Absolutely, I mean, it was a pleasure being up there for a week. I've got to be honest; it was mad, and I don't think I could have coped with the 2 weeks as some of the panelists have been working on. But I mean, what an intense period of activity! And you know, for me, I am heartened, but still a little frustrated, I would say. So I mean, you've heard about the big headlines, but I mean, you know, how quick will we move? Will every country move? So much uncertainty about implementation. So let's park that for a moment. A few of my headlines, I thought it was good that, you know, UK retailers came out and said they were going to halve the food system carbon footprint by 2030. That to me is something that, you know, I feel quite positive about. You've got a climate change and sustainability plan for the education sector. And given that my theme for my presidential year is all about green skills and green recovery, that too, for me, was a bit of a highlight, albeit it was hidden during, you know, other bigger headline items, perhaps. Decarbonising heavy vehicles by 2040 could have significant impacts for my sector. So again, some good news stories there. But when you really reflect on it, you go, well, where was food waste reduction? Where was plastics recycling? Where was greater circularity? Where was resource efficiency? Where was reuse, repair and refill? Well, it was in the margins. CRWM co-hosted a series of webinars, both online and in person at the event. And we had great attendance from people that were equally as frustrated as we were about the lack of these hot topics from being front and center on the main days. And I guess Nature Day, it was great actually, but could have done so much more to join these dots in a circular way, I think. And so although you listen to some of the, you know, some of our great global leaders who did mention circularity, it was more a throwaway comment than it was a critical acceptance of the ability for what is my sector to help do rapid decarbonisation in the short term. And I think that's what was missing a little bit when we listened to some of the headlines coming out in week 2. How quickly will we implement, and how quickly can we expect some of this delivery to happen? And I just think the sector that I represent today, there is so much that we can do, and there is so much that we're going to do as a sector in the next 5 to 10 years anyway. But I think it would have been great if we could have been a little bit more represented at that top table. I mean, and I think, you know, if I reflect a little bit more on that, I just think some of the other sectors and their transition plans, and you look at some of the green recovery agendas that we're hearing from agriculture, manufacturing, chemical sector, transport sector, just to name 4, I think. So many of them are reliant on a set of new resources, or a set of recovered resources, or a set of green resources, or a set of green skills and competencies. And I think that's where COP has missed the point. And I think we've just not joined the agendas of all of our interests sufficiently well for us to be clear about, well, how many of those green chemists do we need, and where do we need them, and what year do they start? Or how many recovered polymers do we need, by which date, in which location, to ensure that that sector ticks its box in terms of its targets. So I think that's where I'm interested for the next 12 months, Colin, is how do we get the dots joined better between our sectors and those that were headlining, to make sure that none of us undermine the interests of the other, and we end up, in 12 months' time in Egypt going, oh, we missed the point, didn't we? Circularity is probably what was missing on top table. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. I think we might unpick a little bit of that as we go forward. And our fourth panelist this morning is Theo Plowman, who's the Policy and Public Affairs Manager at the Landscape Institute. We were going to be joined by one of his colleagues, but unfortunately she's not able to be with us this morning. So at the absolute last minute, Theo has very kindly stepped in. So Theo, thank you very much, and over to you.
Yes, thank you, Colin. Yes, so Sue Morgan, our CEO, sends her apologies. So slightly less glamorous than me is taking over. But I think COP26 has been really encouraging for a few different reasons, but also obviously as highlighted has some letdowns and disappointments. So what's really encouraging for me is that we're finally talking about the integrated approach to environmental challenges. So there's finally recognition that conservation and biodiversity, which has often been viewed as very separate issues to the global heating and atmospheric chemistry, they're finally being seen as linked things. So it's a really important thing for landscape architects. It made quite sobering reading. I looked at our 2008 climate change position statement, and so many of the recommendations and the things that were being said then are still so incredibly relevant now. And yeah, to see that there's been so little change in all those years, it gives me a little bit of hope that COP26 has finally started picking up on some of these things. So I think there's going to be a lot of work with the promises to reverse deforestation, but like Jason touched on, we also need to think about conserving peatlands and provide nature-based solutions of all sorts of different scales and types. So I think this could be an important step change in our relationship with the natural world. But onto the pledges, I think we're far from sufficient, and we've got to view it as part of a continuing process. So there are some good highlights in there for us at a top level. The commitments from India to get half its renewable energy from renewable sources by 2030. I think that's highly significant. And there's also some good pledges, of course, on deforestation and methane. But it's really not clear where these various pledges are going to get us. I think far short of where they need to be. But that's exactly it. Delivery is going to be key, and it's a continuing process that we've got to take forward. And we, as professional institutes and bodies, we really need to drive home this and alter our practices and the DNA of the economy, and drive home those changes. So that was a summary of COP26 for me.
Thank you very much indeed. So to our audience, please, a gentle reminder to put your questions in the Q&A box so that we can keep track of them, and we'll come and answer them in a moment. We've already got a few coming through, so that's great. So keep them coming in. So what I just thought that from my perspective, looking at it from a slight distance, because I didn't actually participate actively during the event, but I thought there were some really interesting positives that came out of it that I just wanted to highlight a little bit more than our panelists have so far. The first one is, and I know this shouldn't be a positive, but it is, there's no challenge to the science anymore. Whereas previously, the amount of debate that we've had to go through over whether it's real, and if it's real, whether it's caused by humanity or planet wobbling or whatever else. So I know it doesn't sound like much, it's kind of damning with faint praise, but actually that is, I think, a really important positive for me. I think it's interesting to see the growth of the multilateral pledge alongside but outside of the UNFCCC framework. All of the ones we've been talking about, the forests, the coal, GFANS, and so on and so forth, they are a subset. They're a coalition of the willing, if you like, to use that sometimes misused phrase. But that again is interesting because I think it shows that some countries are losing patience with the pace, the glacial pace of global consensual action, and are finding ways and places and spaces to do something more themselves. Of course, that does depend on them actually doing what they've pledged to do, which several of you have already mentioned. And coal, I mean, yes, we've got a mention of coal in the final communique, and that's the first time ever. Coal well and truly identified as one of the principal culprits. And that is, again, progress. And okay, it's phase down, not phase out. If that makes a difference, and how much of a difference that makes is something we'll see over the coming time. But just to actually have it there, I think is really important. But on the negative side, we're still arguing about money. Not enough money for adaptation, loss and damage, mitigation, basically not enough money. And at that adaptation versus mitigation point, I think that's still, adaptation is still neglected a bit. It's still a bit the Cinderella of the process. And particularly for a world where we're at 2 degrees or higher, but even at 1.5 degrees, there will need to be some adaptations, both in sort of brutal terms to stop the Thames from flooding London and what have you, but also in terms of how we're going to manage the nature side of things, how we're going to support nature to manage the adaptation it needs to make. So there's just some observations that I thought I'd put through there. So we've got a set of questions. I'm going to go straight into those questions because I think they're more interesting than the ones I'd pre-cooked, to be honest with you. And the first one is from Emma, and she's getting at this point about who's the action aimed at. So her question is, do you think the narrative covers enough what changes we all need to make as consumers, rather than just what governments need to do? Anyone want to volunteer to have a bash at that? The balance, yeah, Theo.
I think it's a really, really good point, and there's been a lot of interesting discourses around this. First point to make on this, I think, is that governments largely are quite terrified to approach this issue. I mean, it's a politically toxic one. Pushing the change onto people, it's a difficult one for governments to broach. But at the same time, we have to understand that we need to make change as individuals, and changes to what we consume and knock-on effects of that. That's an important distinction to make from the changes that need to happen cross-scale to large companies and large polluters. So there's kind of an interesting dichotomy here. A lot of people have pushed back against putting the responsibility on individuals, but I almost feel like the pendulum swung too far. I've seen a lot of discourse lately where it's kind of like, there's no personal responsibility. It's all on, greater industry to make a change, and the figures do back that up largely. But I think there is a step change to be made, as individual consumers, and then that will impact, how companies and these large suppliers do proceed. So I think that it's kind of like a balance to be made on the discourse, and not swinging too far either way.
I bet, Adam, you have something to say on this.
I've always got something to say. I mean, Theo's absolutely right, and I think the politicians were running a bit scared of heading this one, straight on. But I think there's the role of big corporate, and there's the big innovation changes and technology changes that I think will happen, and that doesn't need to be something we worry the public about, because it's going to happen around them. What they do need to worry about is the things that they're making active decisions about. How many times they drive their car, what type of car they drive, but more importantly for me, food waste. I mean, we showcase this RAP Zero Waste Scotland at COP itself, and when you consider that, something like, if it was a country, that fact that always gets rolled out, but if it was a country, the third biggest emitter is food waste after the US and China, and you just think about that and you go, well, what can we do? Well, one's the value chain itself and how you make industry work better and blah, blah, blah. But the other bit is just what we decide to purchase and then leave in the fridge and then decide to get rid of because we've kept it, at the wrong temperature for too long or whatever it might be. Little changes in consumer behavior could have a massive impact in the quick, short term, which would be great because some of these other systemic changes are going to take a lot longer in terms of innovation, finance, and technology. So I think the public get climate change. What we now need to do is help them get small steps they can make that isn't about impinging their freedom or curtailing their ability to do what they want to do, but it's about just, pricking their conscience a little bit about, do you need to do all of those things, or would you be happy to go vegan, 3 nights a week? Well, let's ask the question, because I think at the moment we're not having a discussion. It's much too localized, and that's not how we're going to get, the UK public or the global public to start to make a small step change.
You're going to be asking me not to rinse before putting my dishes in the dishwasher now, aren't you?
I might do.
Jez, if you wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, I want to come in picking up on a little bit of the nuance of what Adam's just thrown in there at the end about people knowing the things that they're able to do, because I think a lot of the time, Theo and Adam are right, that people are really engaged in this issue now. And we know that not just because 100,000 of them wandered through the streets of Glasgow in the middle of COP, but also because we're seeing business begin to come on side, and business wouldn't be coming on side if there wasn't a consumer market for it. So we are seeing that change that Theo sort of begins to predict beginning to happen. But I think a lot of the time people feel trapped in these systems that they don't feel they have control of. We see things as cause to effect. We don't know how we can change the big picture because we can't change these big feedback loops, these pressures. And a lot of the time it paralyzes people and they don't feel like they're able to make the changes that they need. And so back on sort of the nuance of the question, when we look at these international multilateral agreements, there is an element of human behavior on the individual level that is required to meet that. And absolutely, I don't think it currently reflects that nuance. And I don't think people know the changes that they're going to need to make in order for these ambitions to become a reality. And I think that the role there is for all of us, not just those of us who are environmental scientists or who have expertise in circular economy principles or any of this, but all of us as people to start having more conversations about what it means and have those discussions about, like Adam says, about when you drive your car, when you use food waste, so that we can start to shift that balance on an individual level, help people be informed.
I guess one of the questions is whether, so we're all representatives here of professional environmentalist organisations that have people within their ranks who focus on environmental issues. Do even they know what they should be doing? And what about other professional bodies? This is one of the reasons that many of us have signed up to the Professional Bodies Climate Action Charter, because one of the things that we think we need to do is to help our members collectively and individually understand what they themselves can do. And then perhaps they can talk to their niece or their cousin or their uncle and explain to them. Adam always uses his mum as an example, but that kind of thing I think is quite an important aspect. Jason, you wanted to come in.
Yes, can I just jump back to the previous point as well? I think there's one more element to that Caroline McParland has put in the questions actually, and that's around choice. And I think everything that the other three panelists said about this balance between governments, consumer behavior, corporations, we need that balance, absolutely. But there is a point where people want to do the right thing, but they don't have the choice to or can't afford to. And we need to recognize that as something that governments can do and should be doing. And, when you walk into a supermarket and there's 9 things wrapped in plastic and 1 that isn't, but it's twice the price, some people can afford to buy that one thing, but others can't. So we need to recognize that there is a role for government in pushing us down that road. And if that involves a bit of regulation to create a bit more of a level playing field, then government needs to take that responsibility. But yes, sorry, I just need to add that in. Coming back to what our own institutes are doing. So we've got an internal project group and a task group called Action 2030. We've been working since 2019 on that. So we have a carbon reduction plan now, a year-on-year reduction plans, and we've been looking at scope 1, 2, and 3 reductions. We've moved into a smaller building, a more energy efficient building. We've started to look at what we do in terms of logistics, our own work. So around things like our conferences, our training, the actual building we're in. But we've started now to work on projects where we're looking at what our members can do and what they can do to help. And one of those is around sustainable resource use. And it was one of those things that did come as a bit of a surprise to me, but when you think about it, probably shouldn't have, in that we actually use quite a lot of single-use plastic in ecology, things like dormouse tubes, newt bottle traps, reptile exclusion fencing. It's all plastic. It all gets used once and then ditched. So we're starting a project now, starting to look at how we can actually do that better. So we're trying to help our members in their contributions, and not just, how do we get down the road of professionalizing ecology more, making sure nature-based solutions is front and center in every project. Biodiversity net gain now is mandated with the Environment Act. So starting to look at the practicalities as well. Things like, ecologists drive a lot all over the country. How do we make that better? How can we use local consultants, freelancers more? There's lots of things we're starting to do.
I think it's really interesting how when we all look at our own areas of control and expertise, there are some things that we can help people do better. Absolutely. Does anyone else have any more thoughts on the Caroline McParland's question, which is around how do we support people who can't afford to make the choice? Is it just by choice editing, by working with government and business to remove the unhelpful choices and therefore get economies of scale on the more helpful ones, or is there more to it? Adam?
Yeah, well, I think, there's all sorts of community activity going on already to support people that can't afford, some of the options that are currently available. So, community fridges and community freezers are not unheard of. And I think it's making them more accessible, making them more available, but also destigmatizing them. It's not something that only the poor could possibly want to use. I think that they become more of the norm for how we manage transition, if you like. So I think there's something you can do around the community angle here. But I think some of this is about communication. It's about conversation, and it's just about normalizing. Not every choice is going to cost you a lot more money. Some choices might even save you money. But if you're not having the conversation, then you don't know. And I think food waste is an obvious one. If every household in the UK is on average wasting a third of the food it buys, how much money is that with you buying things that you don't need or don't use? That's not costing anybody more money. It's saving them money that they can then use to offset for other, environmental activities. So I think some of this is just about having a sensible narrative, but doing it locally, because this has always been a local authority domain issue. I don't think that is going to get us there quickly enough, and it's not going to demystify it. You need to have a national narrative about some of the step changes that can happen on the back of COP. And I think, letting the public, see top 10 tips of things that you could do to help start the journey would be a fantastic thing, because it's not about my local authority or my sector. It's about my mum. And she's not necessarily going to do the food waste thing when she might decide to use public transport. I think you need to let the public decide which ones they want to do, but we need to make it very obvious for them that they've got options and not all of those are going to be expensive.
And this conversation around individual empowerment and so on is links to something that Brian Maines posted in there about the tweet from Greta Thunberg about you don't need conferences, you just need to get together and do it. Do we see strong signs of that in the UK, do we think? There was the 100,000 people march in Glasgow, but there's a difference between marching and doing. Are individuals taking action? Jason?
So I think some people are. I think there is a case for education here and conversation. I think is key to this. There's just one more, I think, is just about that choice though. Sorry, I'm going to come back to this point around public transport, and where I am in Hampshire, the local council is so strapped that they're cutting bus services. So it continues to take choice away, and it puts people back into their cars, and probably the same people who can't afford to transition right now to an electric car. So we go around in a circle here, but at some point, someone's got to take responsibility for that. And for me, government's got to show the lead on that. Yeah.
Anyone else want to?
Yeah, I'd chime in with that. I think it's not just about the top-down regulation that you set and the laws you set and all of that. That sets a precedent and it sends a message. I think, just a bit ahead of COP26, and I hope someone can explain this to me, but in the headlines, there was the thing about cutting flight duty for short haul flights. And, it's just kind of boggles the mind, because it's the choices are so restrictive in terms of, you know, how we travel still across Europe, or even, you know, just getting to Glasgow. It's so often much cheaper to fly or take that short flight, and you know, there's just real big policy step changes that need to happen in that sort of thing to make the choices obvious and clear. You know, take the train, it's cheaper, it's easier, it's more economical, but those aren't coming, and it says a lot that you know, sort of government action on that is still quite slow, and those are the things that, you know, like has been mentioned, that's the sort of action that we can take, that can be taken here and now. So yeah, it's quite a confusing conundrum when those are the sort of precedences being set. But I think it's really important, going back to our role as professional institutions, we sometimes need to be a bit strict. So we need to act like what we are calling on the government to do. We need to act as almost regulators of our sectors, and you know, we're discussing in the Landscape Institute very shortly to bring in a ban of use of peat on sites, things like that, making important step changes, because until you set regulation from up high, I think the changes are slow to filter down, and you know, I think making those statements and those strong actions is really important to alter our members' behaviours as well. So yeah, it's an important step.
Joseph, did you want to come in as well?
Yes, very quickly, just to say, it really needs to be a whole, every level of action we can, every aspect of society, because I think Jason's absolutely right that the answer to this question is very closely aligned to the answer about genuine choice. Because for people to want to make the choice in the first place, they need to know it exists for them. And so we need every level of action. We need that national level regulation to provide certainty, to get businesses on board. And like Theo says, we can't have different government departments just going off and doing something that is not environmentally sustainable in a different place, because that's going to set us back. And so we need a joined up approach across government. And then we also need a business approach. And we, like Adam, were upset by the lack of circularity being discussed in the high level discussions at COP. And I think there's a design element to this, not just of product design, but also of policy design, because when we come to policies and the way that governments are approaching things, the ability to put genuine choice into the eventual situation needs to be part of that conversation. And what we did see a lot of at COP was talking about co-production a lot more, about bringing communities in to create an eventual vision for that future after the transition that's going to work for them. And it aligns closely with the just transition conversations I think all of us have been having for quite a while now. And really, that speaks to the fact it needs to be across all levels of action, across all society, because there's stuff that all of us can do, and like Theo says, professional bodies as well can be doing some of this, to help make those real choices and help get the people who aren't currently doing enough to do things, help the ones who want to be doing things but don't quite have the ability to do it to be able to, and just support those who are already doing what they need to be doing to bring other people on board as well. So every level of action we can, there's not really any time left to not take those opportunities, I think.
Colin, I think there's a challenge for us as professional institutions in what is our reach into the general public. And I think, you know, we reach professional members and associated members and, you know, whatever licentiate names and things we all use in our organizations. But, you know, there's a series of steps then between them and you know, Joe and Josephine, isn't there? And I wonder, for all of us pooling our expertise and our analytical insight and our, you know, our best practice, we still need to somehow make the leap to common language, because most of us don't run, you know, public facing campaigns as institutions. And maybe that is where we could come together with government, because I'm not sure government have ever run good public facing campaigns. I'm not sure government is that well trusted in whatever brand you pick. So maybe there is something here that, you know, that takes us the next step, you know, between now and, you know, and Egypt, is what is it that we can collaboratively do to bring the masses on board with some of these, you know, co-design, co-policy, choice related activities. Because at the moment, I think, you know, my mum as my benchmark, she's still better informed than her neighbour, and her neighbour is definitely Joe and Josephine, and that's the problem, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Adam. We've got to remember the C in all our organisations' names, the chartership and particularly the Landscape Institute, you know, our responsibility to protect and enhance the natural environment. So I think we do have a responsibility to have that public facing role, and you know, there's more work to be done to do that and work on those campaigns. We obviously, as the Landscape Institute, some of our members are very good at doing that sort of community engagement on a sort of project scale. So going back to food waste, you know, teaching communities to know the value of food and where their food comes from with edible cities projects and you know, urban agriculture. There's lots of kind of interesting and novel ways to engage communities and take them on the journey. So it doesn't feel like, you know, climate change action is being done to them, but they're you know, they're part of the journey. So I think it's a really important point.
Jason, do you want to?
Just something to add, something concrete that we could actually do as a group with the EPF, and I think it's been suggested to Sarah. I've been having a chat with Jemima from the Institute of Chartered Foresters that the Department of Education released their draft climate and sustainability strategy last week, something that we could collaboratively work on and disseminate, comment on. It doesn't get all of public, but I think getting that message clearly into schools, you know, kids are a great way to pass that message on to parents, grandparents. It's one route. The other one that we've been working on more now is STEM ambassadors, and it's something that we recognise is just very little in the way of promoting ecology as a profession, biodiversity as a profession, something we need to do more on.
Yeah,
but yeah,
I think it's great that kids are more turned on to the idea, but I don't know about anybody else. I've got 12-year-old kids, and they really care deeply about the climate crisis, but they still want to buy plastic tap and forget to turn off the room lights when they leave the room. So there's understanding in action.
Yeah, I mean, fast fashion came to mind earlier, around choice earlier as well, as yeah, a big issue.
Yeah, they're boys, they don't really care about fashion yet. So we've got a specific question here around money flows in the UK. Do you have a view around how future levelling up funds should be administered? Should they go to business via local enterprise partnerships, or directly, or via local authorities, or how? Any thoughts about that? This is a question from Mark Parkinson. How do we funnel money into dealing with these issues regionally, basically? Joseph?
Well, yeah, I think the sad truth is, Colin, that basically everything needs more money than exists at the moment. And so there's a lot of different funding streams which we're going to need to utilise in order to do things, particularly for the levelling up agenda, which is tied not only to these natural systems, these climate systems where we're trying to deal with mitigation and to some extent adaptation, but also it's tied to a lot of social and economic systems which historically have led to a lack of infrastructure. And we know we're going to need specific types of infrastructure in order to create a sustainable society. It's tied to that thing we've talked about a lot, a lack of choice for many people, where we're going to need to utilize a lot of different funding streams. There's probably not a single optimal stream to sort of address the question directly in terms of getting that money out. And like I think it was Adam mentioned earlier, in some cases, local authorities are going to be a great place to have money, but in some cases, they're not going to be a great place to get that money to people on the ground who need it. So we need lots of different financial streams to be utilized. There's definitely a role for the private sector and private finance to play into this, because if we go back to the idea of green skills and the green recovery, there's actually probably quite a lot of profit to be made from the private sector in investing in those skills early, particularly in places which have been historically locked out. So when we're talking about levelling up, massive opportunity there. So we will see probably over the next year, next 5 years, more private money coming in, but we also need more direct money from government at basically every level, I think. So again, everywhere we can, I'd say, Colin.
Yeah. Anyone else want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Joseph said. I think from my perspective, I think in the ecology sector, local authorities definitely need more funding. And it's something where we're seeing money diverted away from things where they have regulated obligations like social care, and things like in-house ecological expertise is being eroded. And unfortunately, that has a knock-on effect with things like Environment Act coming through now and biodiversity net gain and the implementation of that. If you don't have an ecologist in-house looking over those plans as they come in, who's scrutinizing them? Are they good enough? Are they going to actually deliver what the Environment Act should be delivering, what its intentions are? So yeah, I mean, we need money everywhere, but you know, I'll put in that small plea.
Money, 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 lots of money. Here's a nice little question for you that's just come in. What can we do to prevent greenwashing? Do we need more regulation of greenwashing claims? Theo?
It's a tricky one and something that we're grappling with a lot at the Institute at the moment. So just going off my own kind of quite narrow knowledge of this is we're doing a lot of work at the moment on getting embodied carbon embedded in the sector. So that's making sure landscape architects are, you know, understanding, managing and reducing their embodied carbon. So for me, it all comes down to data. So having suppliers really engaged in that process of supplying environmental product declarations and you know, signing up to standards, because a lot of particularly in the landscape sector, you know, our suppliers are way behind in terms of providing this data, particularly in this country. I know we've got some kind of pioneering companies, particularly in Scandinavia, that, you know, are already doing a lot of these things, collecting these data from you know, from the minute something's dug out of the ground to the moment it, you know, leaves the lorry and gets to the, you know, the construction site. That's all being controlled by data. So having that data in place for everything that we do and understanding and, you know, making sure that it's all certified and managed is really important. And I think that kind of cripples the ability for companies and particularly suppliers to greenwash as effectively. So yeah, I think data is a really important point in that.
Adam?
Yeah, I think Theo's absolutely right. Robust data, but also having robust systems. So the ESA, which is the trade body in the waste and resources sector, as opposed to the professional body, when it launched its net zero strategy earlier in the year, we also made a tool available for all, you know, operatives in the waste and resources sector, companies of all states, sizes and shapes, to be able to do their own benchmarking of what their interventions were going to be and how they would score using some metrics that we were comfortable with. They aligned with what government metrics are around carbon, but they also kind of reflected our sector a bit better, perhaps. And I think that's really important going forward. I think, you know, as professional institutions, you know, we can do the same, making sure that, you know, what our members are doing and what the organizations that we work with are doing is as good as it can be and is as transparent as can be and can be seen as an exemplar. And if we can raise the bar, then everybody that works with us and for us has to play to the same standard. I think that's how we, you know, we overcome greenwashing, plus, you know, enforcing it where it's being abused.
So we're coming towards the end now, and I've been saving two questions on the Q&A for this bit. The first thing is, do we know what happens between now and Sharm el-Sheikh? What's the process? Because the UK is the president of COP from the beginning of this meeting to the beginning of the next one. So what's going on? Is there space for more interesting activity, or is it all just now, let's wait until the end? Does anyone have a perspective on that? We're all saying none of us are experts. We don't really know. Joseph?
I'll maybe have a bit of a perspective on that, but I also do want to deal with the greenwashing question, because I think the two are quite linked as well, because it's about how we take the action along. And also, I'd quite like to answer the greenwashing question. So I'm going to pretend they're a little bit more linked than maybe they are. But in terms of the road ahead the next year, really big role to play in pushing up ambition. And I think one of the major takeaways from this COP is it's become less of a 5-year cycle, go away, come back in 5 years and change it. We're really getting into the rhythm now of every year we should be driving up ambition, and that has really been an underlying theme. So I would expect to see more over the next year, and really there are commitments which people should be making over the next year. And I think having gone to COP, realized that they need to raise their ambition, maybe not made commitments on the ground because they didn't have the capacity to do that, we will probably see countries walk away and say, well, how could we do this? And over the next 6 months to a year, maybe increase that ambition with a view to ratcheting up NDCs next year. But I think, again, if we're going to achieve that, it requires a whole sector line to it. And there's probably 4 levels, which also speaks to the greenwashing question. The first is the government regulation, the top down, the thing I've just spoken to. The second is businesses getting involved and changing things from a business perspective. The third is getting science embedded into conversations, like I said at the beginning, because that's how you fight greenwashing, is if you have science in every element, if you have the data Theo talks about, then you can really start to challenge the systems of it if it's actually getting to a conclusion. But the fourth, and I think it's going to be really important, not just to this, but also ratcheting up ambition over the next year, is climate literacy embedded at every stage in the curricula, but also across society, so that individuals are empowered with the knowledge they need to say, is this greenwashing or is this not greenwashing, when they see a decision happen. Because once you have that understanding of what the system is, you're much better able to respond to it and make a change. And if governments know that people have that, and increasingly over the next year they will, then they're going to be responsive to that, and we will see that increase in ambition.
Okie doke. Well, that kind of brings me nicely into my wrap it up kind of question. I'm afraid, Phil, I'm going to ignore your question because this isn't a formal meeting of the EPF, and therefore we're not going to answer your question. But the question I do want to ask is based on the one from Steve Roberts. And he's basically saying, how credible is all of this? And he wants a number, a mark out of 10, and your honest opinion that people are taking this seriously. And I'm going to go around each of you and ask you for that number, but also any final thoughts and the one highlight for you. And I'm going to do it in reverse order to the way that you started off. So Theo, that means you get to go first, please. A score out of 10.
Yeah,
reflection and your highlight.
I'm going to go for a 6.8 because
I like it.
Because I just think it really gets back to the summation point that you made, Colin, in your introduction, is that, you know, the argument is no longer there. You know, we're not discussing, you know, whether climate change is happening. We're not discussing or refuting it, and the momentum is really clear to see. So I think I'm really hopeful that things are picking up pace, and you know, Sharm el-Sheikh, you know, I think hopefully will be another big marking point and another step change. So there is hope there. I mean, we were obviously disappointed with some of the pledges, and we're nowhere near there yet. But I do see it as a sort of snowball, and that's what I'm hoping. Hopefully not the sort of snowball with sort of runaway climate change. But my sort of key takeaway point is one I sort of highlighted at the start, and one that we're going to be driving home as the Institute in the run-up, you know, to the next COP, and, you know, driving home locally to our own government, is not focusing on, you know, these faraway technological solutions, but really working on the solutions at hand, the nature-based solutions, and ingraining nature and climate change, and ensuring both the biodiversity and climate crisis are tackled together. So that's a really key point for me, is that these are finally being seen as things that are intertwined, and we need to drive home that message and ensure our solutions provide that integrated approach. So yeah, that's all from me.
Thank you. Adam, a number, any reflections, and your take-home point?
So number 6, little less optimistic, but I was going in with low expectations, Colin, to be honest with you. You know, on the long journey up, as I was facing train closures, road closures, you know, I was just thinking, yeah, what am I doing going to Glasgow? Anyway, so it's a 6 because I still think the resources and waste space, the circularity and the consumption issues missing from the core debates kind of undermines it all for me, because that's where some of the real opportunity, I think, lies, particularly the short-term opportunity. But on the upside, I think those themes did find themselves in some keynote presentations, and they were being talked about quite openly across the 2 weeks. So in some respects, we are there, and we are going to make a significant contribution over the next, 10 years, I would suggest. So I am heartened by that, but that was happening irrespective of COP, I would argue. So that's why it's a 6.
Thank you. Jason, a score, reflections, and a take-home.
So I was going to go with a solid 6 as well. I think it's slightly more than a 50-50 time course as to whether we're I am an optimist. I think on that particular question as well about how seriously government's taking it. I think there's other things engaged in this, other things involved as well that, you know, and I'm not a politician, but there are geopolitics involved in this as well. You know, countries want to grow, they have growth ambitions. You know, I don't know where you put the USA wanting to remain the world superpower and China wanting to take that top spot is somewhere in there in you know, the big player considerations. You could put India in there as well. There are countries as well that need to alleviate poverty, and that involves some amount of growth, and we shouldn't be curtailing that, but it needs to be done in a green way. So there's more to it than just climate, but you know, it has to be addressed. My highlight takeaway is probably going to be the same as Theo's around nature being explicitly included in there, and nature-based solutions, and how we can make sure that the outcomes from this, not only do we get action, but we get the link into COP15, the biodiversity COP next year. Next year. And make sure that those are joined up approach. You know, we can address climate change all we want, but if we don't address nature loss, you know, that's a losing battle.
Thank you. Joseph, score, reflections and take home.
I think a 6 is pretty good, Colin, and maybe I'll pull it to a 6.1 to err on the side of optimism. And maybe if the pledges aren't met, it'll be the quite appropriate 2.4 would be where we end up instead. But my big takeaway, it's the one I mentioned at the beginning. It's the narrative shift that we've seen about how people are taking these issues seriously at the global level. And like you say, Colin, how people are taking science seriously. It may not be that we've sort of broken down the barricades with this one, but we've certainly aimed the cannon in the right direction now. And we've opened up a small enough breach that science and environmental science and the environmental sector can start flowing through over the next year. So for me, big takeaway is we have an option to push forward through to get transformative change, which is what the IES is fighting for with its manifesto. It's what we're going to be doing over the next year to try and make that happen.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all of our audience who joined us today and for the really interesting questions. As I say, I didn't need to use any of my pre-cooked ones because yours were far more interesting. So thank you for that. Thank you very much indeed for our panelists, Theo, Adam, Jason and Joseph, particularly Theo for stepping in at the last minute and Joseph for joining us whilst severely under the weather. And I'm going to hand back to Sarah to wrap us all up. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you all. Just a quick note, in case you missed any of today's webinar, the recording will shortly be made available online via the Environmental Policy Forum website, and I posted the link in the chat. Also, a quick look forward to the next event in the series, which is on Thursday, reaching net zero via science-based targets. So do go check that out and register for the event. Again, the link is in the chat. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you there. But in the meantime, thank you and goodbye.